This is Identity at the Center.
Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jim McDonald. Unfortunately, Jeff Stedman is still traveling and is unable to make it for this episode. But fortunately for you all, I've got an awesome guest in Eve Mailer. She's the founder and CEO of Venn Factory. Eve, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be back again. Thank you.
Again, and I don't think we've asked you this question, but every time I see Venn Factory, I want to hear the background for that. Why did you call your company Venn Factory?
I mean, it's a little bit of an in-joke, but who doesn't love a Venn diagram anyway, if somebody doesn't know the in-joke? But, starting in 2005, I think I started putting together 3 set Venn diagrams to compare. Originally, SAML, OpenID, and InfoCard, if you remember all those things. And people appreciated the comparison. I wasn't the first person to, put identity and Venn diagrams together, but it ended up being kind of popular. And I did a whole series on my blog back in the day when I was blogging at xmlgirl.com. And so some people started calling me Queen of Venn and started being disappointed if I didn't include a new Venn diagram in any presentation I was giving. So I just decided to lean into it for fun.
I love it. And I know now that you've told some of that story prior episodes. Guys, if you're interested in going back into the Eve archive, go to idacpodcast.com/listen, or just go to idacpodcast.com, click on the listen button. We have a cool handy dandy search screen. You can search for Eve Mailer. That's Maler. And you'll see all those episodes. And the first one that she was on is when we got her identity origin story. So I asked Eve to come back this week. Eve and I were going back and forth, and she's working on a book targeting CEOs to kind of put together the whole story for why identity in the enterprise needs to be empowered and resourced as a product and not just as plumbing. And I thought that was real interesting. And she also mentioned that when she talks to the Identity Geek community, she talks about mastering IAM's higher purpose, which I think is very heady. And I think that Identity Geek thing is like, well, I'm an Identity Geek. I co-host a podcast with another Identity Geek, and we target Identity Geeks as our listener community. So I can't wait to kind of dive into this. And Eve, why are you writing this book? Why are you writing a book for CEOs?
It's because I have seen an area of innovation among the customers that I've worked with over my time working with identity vendors that has led me to believe that greater visibility across the enterprise of what identity can do for you and the downsides if you don't do it right, they're being felt, and the only person who can really make it right is the CEO with the, input and approval of their board. So I'm kind of just going for the gusto in, I've talked previously about mastering IAM's higher purpose. It's got a lot of different purposes, and we kind of put it into a box when we just say, well, it's about security or it's about user experience. And there's a whole long list of things. We can't solve all those things alone. We need an intensely cross-functional focus. So I'm just going to write this for CEOs who need to hear the message so that they can be more competitive and be more safe and do better for their customers and all of the above.
Yeah, and my experience tells me a lot of what, I got a draft version of your table of contents, and a lot of it really spoke to me. And so we're going to get into some of that, but I wanted to kind of point out one thing that jumped off the page for me, which was subheading chapter 1. So not even getting into the text yet. You said, why digital identity has become every executive's nightmare, and you're next. So give us a little bit of flavor on that.
Yeah, why nightmare? Well, I'm trying to obviously dramatize a risk that executives, particularly CISOs, but also CEOs, are facing, and they may not really be fully aware that they're facing. It used to be that if you had a breach, you would be fined and there might be some terms that you have to live up to. But now the FTC and the SEC are all putting more burdens personally on these executives. And it isn't just, there's actually an organization called the Professional Association of CISOs that started 2 years ago, I think, because of the threat that CISOs are under for personal liability if something goes wrong in their security practices. But CEOs are also at risk. And there's a couple of examples of this. So Drizzly was one famous one, with the FTC kind of putting CEOs on notice that they have to get their security practices right. And we know, you and I know, people listening to this know, the importance of identity in that proposition. But so CEOs are personally liable for some of these things happening. So they need to be aware of that, and they need to know what to do about it and why it doesn't have to be all doom and gloom, and it can actually look like a growth engine.
Yeah, that reminds me a lot of Sarbanes-Oxley, which was the driver for everything I am in the past, right? CEOs had to sign off on financial statements like, these folks work for you. You need to know what's going on within your organization. I also think you mentioned CEOs and CISOs. That's much different. Like for me, I've gone and worked with organizations that the CISO doesn't own all of identity. They might own identity for the internal, but certainly when you get to customer IAM, it starts becoming more of a mixed bag, right? And
yeah,
I think that's probably the perspective, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I would assume that a lot of the perspective you're coming from is like, it's owned in different parts by different people.
Yes. And that's where I was sort of coming from about 2-3 years ago. I remember sitting on a customer advisory board meeting, listening to one of the excellent practitioners of the art, who was one of our customers, representing a perspective that I hadn't had prior about how to do identity. He was an identity product owner. And there's this whole argument, you have yourself hosted arguments about the CHIDO, the Chief Identity Officer. And from my perspective, we haven't had enough clarity to know what a CHIDO would be or where it should live. And I think we have to go pretty deep down the rabbit hole of different organization structures and different industries to actually find out what makes sense and how broad that remit has to go. And you're right. Quite often it's sort of workforce identity or broader workforce identity and customer identity. And so that's a reasonable split per population. But I've started cataloging all the places that identity can live. And in fact, all the cases where it's kind of broken up. I call it sold for parts. And it's just all over the place. So, where would you put a CHIDO? If you had a CHIDO, do you know the answer for where you'd put it? I don't actually think so. I think more analysis has to be done. And that's what I'm trying to bring to bear the book.
Yeah, and I feel like organizational structures are changing. We've seen kind of the matrix organization structure end with the picture, but I think over time it becomes more matricized or matricized than less, right? We're not going back to the old kind of hierarchical structure. But I think that begs the point, which is you've got all these pockets of identity, you've got all these perspectives. Mm-hmm. I don't think a book about, CEO, you have to be personally engaged in cybersecurity would be as compelling, right? Because it's like, that's why I hired the CISO.
Yeah. Well, and that's the problem. If it's just about security, they think it's taken care of. But if it's also about, and I call them the 4 Ps, I think I've talked about that with you guys before. If it's about protection and it's about personalization and it's about payment and it's about, what people want, you're sort of stuck for an answer and figuring out, who owns it? And the last thing the CEO needs is, I have to be responsible for this, this entire thing. No, I have people for that. But the question is people, not person. So how do we do it?
Right. And we as identity practitioners are oftentimes the ones who are trying to pull the plug from both ends and plug it together. And that's if there's only one plug on each side. So, yeah.
It's a great image, actually. I'm picturing all of the power cords and you don't know which one leads to what and trying to connect them up.
Well, and it's raining and you're standing in a puddle. Good luck. If you don't do it right, you might get electrocuted.
Yeah, the consequences are severe, but don't worry, just keep going and keep going without maybe the full empowerment that you can imagine having, without the full budget that you can imagine having. So, this is why it's for the CISO, for the CEO, because they have the ability to see through to the strategic advantage in doing this more thoroughly. So I want to convince that person to kind of make the job easier, not only of, identity owners, identity practitioners today, but really everybody who struggles with that. Boy, I don't know if you remember the old Saturday Night Live routine about, it's a floor wax, it's a dessert topping. Hey, you guys, it's both. Now what do we do? So I want to make everybody's lives easier by making that case much more clearly.
Now, the word on the tip of everybody's tongue these days is AI. And Jeff and I often say we could call this AI at the center. We had at least an AI conversation every episode. So this was chapter 2's subheading. Another one that was an attention grabber. How artificial turned every CEO into a sitting duck. Why did you say that? That's a very graphic image, I think.
Yeah. I mean, we know the stories, and I want to bring these stories to life about how spear phishing has become an extra added threat when AI is scaling and automating those attacks. We saw the Hong Kong financial executive actually succumb and approve a transfer of, US equivalent $25 million. There's another favorite story of mine, which was when an executive of Ferrari he's an executive of the company, and his purported CEO got in touch with him over WhatsApp and sounded urgent. So, he hopped onto a call with, turned out not actually the guy, right? And this is what deepfakes are doing to us. And he cleverly used what we would call dynamic knowledge-based authentication to challenge this purported CEO because he sensed something was off. And he was like, hey, remind me, what was that book that you recommended to me the other day? Click. So he succeeded in beating back that attack. But this is constant among the C-suite, because those are the folks who hold the pen for so much control of financial resources and trade secrets and, all of the material non-public information that they're exposed to. So that's, it's a honeypot of things that are worth attacking. And that's where we see AI. One of the places we see AI being put to use.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're setting up the picture of why is this so important from an organizational standpoint? What is the level of impact of the fraud that can take place? And identity is kind of like I was thinking as you asked that question that CEO used knowledge-based authentication. He didn't even realize it.
Yeah, he wouldn't have given it a name, right?
He would not have given it a name.
We have names for this, but we don't, a CEO is not going to want to know the name. They just want the problem to be solved, and they want the risk to be mitigated. And they want the acceleration of business to be accomplished. And so that's kind of where I've been, the research that I've been doing is reaching out to all the folks that I've been talking to about, well, where does identity live for you? And what scope do you have? And, sort of comparing notes across those different domains.
I think that the timing is also so important here because we weren't talking about deepfakes 5 years ago. Or 5 years ago, if we were talking about it, it was like science fiction. But now it's reality.
Physical masks, right?
Physical masks, right.
Where you put on something. It's near Halloween, so I've been seeing some great examples of physical masks, but it's the virtual ones that we got to watch out for.
Yeah, where's it going to be 5 years from now? And if you don't start thinking about the problem now and preparing now, you're going to be behind the curve. And this is not a curve you can afford to be behind.
Absolutely.
So I follow kind of the stock market a little bit, and we're in this big evolution that's happening again. It happened in the 90s, 2000s, where companies that got ahead and digitized and said, we are a technology company, whether they were, an old film company or whatever they were doing. Yet if they hung on to what they were doing and kind of pen and paper and our customers like the physical touch and coming into our brick and mortar stores, most of those companies are gone if they didn't kind of latch on. And I think the same thing is going to happen with AI. Companies that fail to kind of latch on and invest now, they're going to have a hard time surviving in the future. Because catching up is not just a decision to make 10 years after, like, hey, we better catch up. It's like, it's too late.
And humans tend to catch up, at least mentally, linearly, whereas AI is producing non-linear changes, hopefully gains, but also risks. So, there's a famous like Harvard Business Review case study around Kodak not wanting to compromise its, film selling business and losing the entire game. And it's been making the rounds on LinkedIn again today. I noticed it's a really good case study. And if you're trying to protect your core business, which has, maybe incremental innovations around it, and yet some digital things are happening that are going nonlinear, you ignore those at your peril for sure. And they really are on both the risk side of the ledger and the growth side of the ledger.
Yeah, the interesting thing about that business case, and I didn't go back and read it recently, but I remember this, it's always stuck with me, is that Kodak invented the digital camera.
There you go.
But
irony of ironies.
The irony of irony, right? Is like, that's going to cannibalize the rest of our business. So it's like, but you can't.
Yeah, better not do it yet.
Better not do it
this
yet.
This is where identity is like, it's because we've all become digital humans, and our businesses have become digital, even like the very brick and mortar businesses that need to be in the real world have become digital. We're all susceptible to these trends. So, we shouldn't just think, digital isn't for us. It's too late for that conversation, I believe.
Yeah. So the CEOs need to pay attention to this. And going through your table of contents, and thank you for sharing it with me. I will not reshare it. And I understand also, look, this is like a draft, right? So you're kind of in the formulation stage still for a lot of this.
Yeah. But I'm writing every day. Yeah.
I pulled pieces out, little nuggets that kind of grabbed my attention. So one was that identity has a homeless problem.
Yeah. That has to do with the fact that I was even looking for like industry trends of where you'd put some, majority identity owner in your organization. And even among, let's say, large banks, I don't see a huge amount of consistency. I do see a few little patterns here and there, but it looks like the sold off for parts kind of picture where I think I might have mentioned this at some point when we were speaking previously, but, I spent some time at PayPal, and back in the day, its risk and fraud organization owned authentication, not access management, but authentication, because the primary source of fraud was coming from that kind of locus. And so that's one way to do it. I believe PayPal has now changed, but like there are lots of organizations where they're kind of indecisive about where to put identity role. And you can waste a lot of time if you're just not trying to figure out, work the problem basically, and figure out, yes, it's going to be cross-functional. Yes, it's going to be quite matrixy. Let's decide. Let's not worry about what everybody else is doing. Don't have to look at somebody else's paper to see what the answer is, but figure it out fast and figure it out decisively. And that's, part 3 of my book is planned to be like, well, that's how you do that.
I think one of the challenges the CEOs face is that at the end of the day, their organization is full of people. If it was just all a bunch of AI agents, and maybe it will be someday, it would be a lot easier. Just like tell them what to do and they do it.
The digital workers. I don't know. I worry about those digital workers because they don't understand limits.
Or they might not do it. Right? You got a point.
Point taken about, efficiency and whatever it is that they're doing.
Yeah. So I don't know how things happen at PayPal, but I think that a lot of times CEOs don't see this as important enough to rock the boat over. And I think that deciding who should be in charge of identity, what are the bounds of identity, is less of a strategic decision. It's more based on, well, how do I deal with this problem and piss off the least number of people within my organization so that we can just forget about it and move on? But yeah,
it's infrastructure, it's plumbing. As long as you take care of the tickets on a regular basis, we'll be okay. That's that's the kind of thinking that I think has gotten us into problems. And one of the things I've been surfacing in some of the interviews that I've been doing has been awesome stories of synergies when you actually treat it as strategic and look across the whole organization and realize, well, you put in place this infrastructure for, let's say, identity verification. And you discover that your call center is having a challenge because something happened post-COVID. And, there's lots of new calls and we've got, sort of incidences of fraud. And you start to be able to actually take those plugs and sort of put them together without having to reinvent any new technology, without having to redeploy anything new, but kind of just doing a few new flows of what you already have and making multiple departments happy and actually seeing a reduction in fraud. So like an example like that convinces me that we just have to bring these examples to the world, right? You need them sort of like in your pocket so that you can convince the next executive who needs to be convinced that this is not just theoretical.
Yeah. So where do you think identity should live and who should be in charge of it? You talked about products and product owners and things like that. So lay it on us. What is the strategic decision?
You put me on the spot for like a place it should live. I will say one of the things I've been finding is that workforce and consumer, to put things into very large, imprecise buckets, can deserve to be separate. And it's not out of the question that workforce should live in security because you need a home. You don't want like to have dotted lines everywhere in your reporting structure, or under the CIO, or I've seen under like technology as a common sort of pillar. When I look at the consumer side, I do see more and more either almost a line of business of its own, although it's not. It is kind of like services that serve all the product. But I do see this kind of shared product infrastructure role. And I don't hate it. I think it's been a good choice for those excellent practitioners that I've been talking to who have, great best practices to share. I think there's a kind of a nice dividing line that could obtain, and I'm not here to tell anybody like where they should definitely place it, but where the back end services of identity are owned in this kind of shared product land, and all the front end work might be for each individual product because they're having to tune very precisely to their personas. So that's a potential answer. But I've also seen it owned by marketing. Sometimes it is owned by fraud, which is a really interesting one. If you're a financial institution, that might not be such an unusual thing to do. So I don't know that I'd recommend any one place. The most important thing is understand how wide the rabbit hole goes and, who all you have to communicate with and collaborate with and sometimes get critical input from. I think last time we spoke, I was talking about RACI charts and like, I feel like everybody starts to just nod off and go to sleep when I say RACI chart, but there's a little bit of that exercise to it, right? To get it right.
I think this idea of the chief identity officer makes a lot of sense. It's like, that's an organization saying that we understand how important identity is to the big picture act. I mean, the difficulty is not every organization is going to appoint a chief of identity, but having some kind of senior position. I mean, Jeff and I have always talked about that every IAM program had to have a program manager. And what we thought is like, because he and I kind of came through a similar path in that we both ran programs and we kind of like came up through the grassroots because we were kind of good at taking those two wires and plugging them together while standing in a puddle of water. And so that's an important skill. But I think in a big company where identity is so important, touches so many things, it's just not realistic to think that it can be done at a grassroots level and be successful. So here's another one that I grabbed from your TOC. It was escaping the trap of organizational paralysis. And, I think this is what that point is all about is that trying to say that, okay, this is just fix this at the grassroots level is kind of, I'll call it, I think it's a cop out, first off. I think it's a cop out because, I mean, when you and I were going back and forth about this episode, I sent you like a reminder of like what, putting a dollar value on identities. I kind of always think back to when Meta bought WhatsApp. I think they paid something like $19 billion for WhatsApp. I mean, an incredible amount of money. And I think at the time, they were talking about like users. To me, the users were identities because they weren't, logging in using another IDP. Is like WhatsApp had all these identities globally of like millions and millions of people, and you put a dollar value on those things.
Yeah.
And you just can't.
This is like when you're looking at consumer identity, and that's something I tracked back in my Forrester days. Remember when we had these social sign-in broker identity providers? These are the Jan Rains and the Gigyas that specialized in bringing user populations to markets indirectly through assisting those being IDPs, being social identity providers. And not to put too fine a point on it, those were markets for, identified user records. So there's a downside to that too. There's kind of the dark side of it. There's privacy concerns, and there's, kind of the way we're treating human beings. Nonetheless, it is absolutely a corporate asset. It's managed today as a corporate asset. And one of the things I wrote about in my Consent is Dead paper was looking at, it was like a Nestle investor deck talking in 2-3 years ago about their goal to have this many more hundreds of millions of consumer records. Now, they were striving to have more of those be first party, which is absolutely identities. They're managed by that company as a first party. They do have, third party data that they access as well through the various MarTech kind of stacks. But that's an asset of the company. Employee records, it's data you have to protect. It's an asset, but not in the same way. It's not the kind of explosive thing that you look to grow in and of itself. Whereas, anybody would be happy to have, say, OpenAI numbers in terms of they're up to like 700 plus million users now. So that's just a value in and of itself for sure.
I think more companies want to shrink that workforce identity, not just from like layoffs and stuff, but like if you've got multiple identities for a smaller number of people, like if you said, we have 300,000 workforce identities, but only 50,000 people work here, that's not a good thing.
This brings up a thought. I've been trying to sort of categorize the different populations, putting non-human identities aside for one moment. I've been watching the industry conversation for like the last 5 years, focus a lot more on that middle part of the Venn diagram of consumer and workforce where it's like B2B. And I think it's actually worthwhile getting a little bit more specific about B2B because it's all about who has the kind of power dynamic in the relationship. So if it's channel partners, you want to enable them, and they're a bit like customers because they lead to customers. If they're part of your supply chain and it's B2B, it's a little bit more like, well, you have to kind of do what we say. We have these standards and you're upstream from us and we have to protect ourselves. And so supply chain is a lot more like, those kinds of partners are a lot more like employee, the larger and wider employee population. And channel partners and things like sort of loosely held brokers, like think about insurance brokers or, car dealerships, that sort of thing. They're a lot more on the customer side of the equation, right?
That's right.
And how much you can control them and how much you have to sort of live with the constraints that they have because they're them. So I kind of think B2B really breaks down around that sort of, are they upstream from you or are they downstream from you? Something to consider if we're going to be handing out identity responsibilities.
It all kind of fits into this bucket now, third-party risk management. That's the hot buzz term.
And for good reason.
Yeah. Well, it's a couple steps in, but it always comes back to the identities because it's human beings or even, non-human accounts that are going and accessing systems. But a lot of times when you're talking about these third parties, they have to get human accounts set up. And how do you manage those? How do you and that's not a question I'm asking you to answer right now, because I think there's a lot that goes into it. But you're right. When you start talking about those brokerages or kind of the third parties that are kind of more on your customer or distribution
with your top line. Yeah. You want to enable them just as much as you want to enable customers, direct customers, to have no friction, right? Because they're the ones selling your insurance policies. They're the ones actually, bringing the customers to you. So it looks an awful lot like the reducing friction from a sale kind of user journey.
This is, I think, exactly like in my career, what resonates the most to me in terms of why you need to have one person kind of like these. As a practitioner, we say, all right, well, now we're going to, bring brokerages or dealerships into our identity management system. And and you have somebody lobbying, literally, we should have 6-character passwords. They should have to log in once a year, things like that. And then you'll have a CISO saying, no, they should have 12-character passwords and they should expire after 30 days. And their session should only last 15 minutes. And then you're there as the identity practitioner holding the two ends of trying to plug things together. And you're doing it at the grassroots, and you're just trying to get these two people with diametrically opposed views of how. And I know I'm just picking on like one thing, the passwords, but it's the overall picture.
So much.
Yeah. And like, to me, like, I don't even know if the CEO realizes those kind of conversations happen, because I think a lot of times the CEOs they start off as salespeople, right? They're the ones who are dealing with the customers, and they learn how to meet like a sales objective, and then they become in charge of a business unit and other people who are out selling, and then eventually like they rise to the top, and they're running the whole organization. They never spent time on IT and operations, and so they really don't understand it. And as it becomes more and more complicated, identities, we take it for granted, right? But these are folks that, it's complex stuff, and they don't have RAM storage for it, because it's just not something they want to think about.
I mean, there's different kinds of CEOs, right? And some of them, a lot of them are kind of sort of biased towards sales. Especially if they sort of grew up with the business as it really rocketed up. There are some who, might have come out of techie stuff. There might be some who came out of operations. I was very fortunate to work with Fran Roche, who, boy, he'd done so many things. He'd had some technical background. He had a great business head, and he still does. But like, you can't assume anything about, first of all, that person's level of knowledge. Second of all, their immediate concerns are really up-leveled from the concerns of somebody who's having to make difficult choices among all those different sort of squabbling parties about, password rotation and, what the user journey looks like. Like, we want to keep those operational concerns of identity decided on with the right group of people to optimize, to not just have a local maximum, to optimize for the overall best outcome. But you want the metrics to really speak to the top line and bottom line of the business. That's one of the things I've been doing, has been collecting everybody's like best metrics, and some of them are really quite interesting. I want to sort of break out of the mold and go for something that the CEO will sit up and take notice, and we have some evidence that they're board relevant directly.
Yeah. That would be kind of a great way that people could help you too, right? As if they can kind of like help those conversations happen.
Yes. I would love for people to reach out, by the way. Like, I'm still interviewing, I'm still collecting data. I would love to hear from people if they consider this a call for stories about any of the stuff that we're talking about today. They can send mail to info@venfactory.com if they want to reach out with a good nugget or two. Always happy to chat.
That'd be awesome. That's a way to start building a relationship with your CEO. And I make the case, or COO, because I find that a lot of times the COO is an organization, if you have that CEO typecast that I kind of mentioned, where they don't really understand the operations. They typically will have somebody who's in the COO position who really understands it and really knows how the whole business works, knows who the players are, things like that. So I think that's also probably pretty relevant in this situation.
For sure. Yeah.
So many gems in your table of contents, far too many to cover in one episode, but one that jumped out at me was identity security, an AI-infused trend whose time has finally come. And I mostly want to pick on the term identity security, right? It's hot right now.
It is very hot.
And it's very hot right now. And I want to know, is that different than identity access management or digital identity? And should we now say we're in identity security when we as identity practitioners explain to other folks what we do?
Right. So the word trend in that particular section title has to do with, if you remember the game that I played from stage at Identiverse a couple of years ago, Trends and Transients, I like to just I'm trying to introduce a bunch of different trends and things that aren't trends or shouldn't be trends to my readership, where they may not have heard of any of these things. And so I introduce identity security as, I think, a bona fide trend. And the more I think about it, this started with, I think Gartner invented ITDR as a kind of extension of the XDR or STAR DR that, we're familiar with from security writ large. And there was a lot of resistance to it for a few years. People were like, what does this mean exactly? And then somebody came up with ISPM. Maybe it was also Gartner, I don't know. And both of those things have a role in securing your identity estate. So they're kind of like a meta thing on top of identity being done, seen that way. But I like the identity security phrase to kind of go over the top of roughly those two, because we have examples of different areas of security, like application security, data security. Now we've got AI security, which is a specialty that also grew very fast, just like AI itself. And I think identity security is a legitimate security discipline that requires us to not just assume that doing IAM means, well, it's there for protection. I say your protection is the first of the 4 Ps. It is there for protection, but done wrong, it can end up giving you extra vulnerability because it's so critical to your security estate. So to me, identity security is the hygiene that perhaps we should have applied all along, until we realized, oh, geez, we're the first pillar in zero trust. Then we should make sure that these things are done correctly. So I see identity security as a legitimate area of security applying to identity the same way that IAM and IGA apply to security and to other things.
I think so too. I kind of feel like digital identity and identity governance, those are areas that have become the domain of the identity practitioner. I feel like identity security is almost encroaching on other areas, or maybe that's not the right way to think about it, but I feel like most of the time, now I think everybody's just getting on the identity security bandwagon, just like everybody got on the zero trust bandwagon. But I kind of feel like at least where it started was identity security was, we're taking areas of security and we're making them identity aware, which was always kind of like what Identity at the Center was about, was that the identity is the most important asset. And if you can start plugging it into all of your other security systems beyond business systems, but just from a cyber perspective, plugging it into your logging and monitoring and alerting, et cetera, and doing that in a two-directional kind of mode where it's identity aware and it can take action by saying, hey, we found that Eve's account looks like it's been compromised. Why don't you just shut that thing off for a little bit until we have time to do an investigation or something?
Well, and I have had some interesting conversations around that too, because what was the domain of the security operations center team but they've struggled to actually achieve some of the things they've been trying to, like some of the visibility that they wanted to get into identity-related vulnerabilities. Identity security tools are coming along to help them, or like the identity security tools don't care if they're sort of run by an identity team or a SOC team. That's a choice that an individual company can make. And I've kind of seen both, and there's new coordination. So to me, that's all to the good. Like that's what we kind of wanted out of this, was to do security better in the very first instance of, modern digital identity. So maybe we'll be able to do it better. Now it is changing the vendor landscape somewhat. And, cybersecurity vendors have been like, ooh, those things look good over there in identity land. So it's shaking things up a little bit.
Yeah. And I think from the practitioner's perspective, we should be supportive of this model. And I think that we as individuals, as we kind of like grow in our career, we may end up overseeing the whole thing. I think that's one trend that I've seen happening more and more over the last 5-10 years, is that you're talking to a lot more CISOs who made their way through identity. Like, oh yeah, I ran the identity program and now I'm the CISO.
Mm-hmm.
And I always kind of expected that to happen, because I feel like in identity, while you might not have your firm roots in like network security, you might not be a TCP/IP person, et cetera, but you've got kind of a set of skills of working across the enterprise, working across organizational boundary. And to me, that's the mark of a leader, somebody who can do that successfully and realize that you're working with people who might have a different perspective.
That's a really, really good take. And I like that. It's like the more we see IAM folks kind of rise through the ranks to become security leaders, the more we'll know that their broad focus throughout a lot of different functions, their ability to kind of evangelize, their ability to coordinate, it'll be good for security. It'll be good for CISO land. It'll be good for organizations.
Yeah. So Eve, I really appreciate your time today. Really excited for when your book comes out, and just kind of peeling back the what do they call it? The third wall or fourth curtain?
I think.
Yeah, something like that. We had I had a network issue, so I'm not even sure where we are in terms of our timeline, but I think we're right on track to move into this lighter note. And the lighter note is something that Jeff and I started a few years back, and kind of the idea was to kind of just end on something a little bit lighter, a little more entertaining. We want the whole thing to be educational and entertaining, but this lighter note is meant to be more on the entertaining side. But I think with you, I want a little more education too, because you are somebody who does a lot of public speaking. And I'm thinking that you probably have a routine, or, I always watch baseball, right? And that people do the same routines. Like they used to always like readjust their batting gloves and, spit on home plate and whatever they did to get ready for their at bat. I'm sure you don't. If you spit on something before you get up there for public speaking, we don't want to really know about it. But what are some of the things that you do to get yourself in the zone for public speaking?
Gosh, I do plan, I do practice, but I don't know what the first thing that's going to come out of my mouth is until about 5 minutes before I get up on stage. And usually the adrenaline at that point is so high that I end up getting sort of weirdly creative. And I kind of just never know what that's going to be. So I leave a little bit of it unplanned. And I will tell you, I had this great opportunity in June to go down to Sao Paulo, Brazil for the first time and give a talk for the organization NetBR. And I was one of two very privileged people who were speaking English at this conference that was otherwise in Portuguese. And I decided a few minutes before to have the first sentence come out of my mouth be in Portuguese. So I paced around trying to practice it for myself. That was merely, thank you for having me here. I was just hoping to be respectful to my hosts and to just tell them that I really appreciated being there and was just thrilled about the opportunity. So it went okay. It was a little halting. I've spent a lot of time in Duolingo since.
Well, that was brave. I mean, I don't know if I would have the courage to do that, but I like it.
I've been using it in everyday conversations.
Me personally, I'm an over preparer because I kind of feel like if I'm giving a presentation, if I've gone over and I said it 5 times, if I get nervous or I lose my train of thought, I can more easily pick up. So I'll get up in my hotel room and I'll stand up and I'll do the presentation. And I don't know, so something about like standing up while I'm practicing makes me feel a little more prepared to get up there and do it.
It makes total sense.
Yeah. And I also don't find, I think frequency of presenting is a huge thing. If you're presenting like every week, it's not even a thing, right?
Yeah. I mean, I still, there's a little bit of there's a frisson of, nervousness or whatever. And I think it helps to get you on your toes mentally. But I do prepare, I'm doing a webinar at the end of the week. I'm doing in-person talk in a few weeks. Like all of those things, you need to know what goal you have. You want to know what you want to get across. What are the key takeaways? If you just remember those, bulleting it out is very handy. I have a friend who's throwing herself a birthday party, and she decided, based on my story of having done a lightning talk at something that was called a nerd night back when I was in Seattle, she is having her friends give 5-minute presentations at her birthday party. And I think it's wonderful because anybody who's nervous about public speaking, a little wine, a little, friendship, blowing out the candles on the cake, and a presentation. It's the perfect opportunity to practice if you're nervous. So
that's a great idea. Great idea. Well, Eve, thank you so much for doing this. I'm going to wrap it up now by reminding everyone, if you've got a connection to your CEO or somebody who's a CEO in your family or a COO in your family.
Any executive leader, honestly, who might have stories or might feel this pain or might have a great metric to share, get in touch.
They should reach out to Eve. We'll put Eve's LinkedIn and that email that she mentioned in the show notes. Check us out. We're on the web at idacpodcast.com. Our YouTube channel is idacpodcast.tv. We're always available in your favorite podcast listening application. We'd appreciate it if you would subscribe, give us a review. We always like that, and tell other folks about the podcast. And that's how it spreads, by word of mouth. So really appreciate your time again, Eve, and thank you everyone for listening. We'll catch you on the next one.
You've been listening to Identity at the Center. We hope you've enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review. And we'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit the website at identityatthecenter.com. See you next time on Identity at the Center.